So, Ned, I want to hit on a topic that Brandon raised as an example of
I see that.
someone who's using cloud, Project JEDI. So you want to give people who haven't followed the story just a real quick on what Project JEDI is and then the controversy and so on.
Oh, yeah. Well, we're not going to be able to cover all of it here, but just the short version. So the Department of Defense, and I think especially their research and development arm of the Department of Defense, was offering up a contract to a single cloud provider for $10 billion over the course of 10 years. So it's really $1 billion a year. And also, if you read the fine print, they're allowed to back out of it at any time, whenever they feel like it. But the whole idea was that they were going to offer it to a single cloud provider, and that would be their cloud provider of choice. So obviously the usual suspects came out of the woodwork: Azure, AWS, Google, and I believe IBM.
And Oracle.
Of course.
Oh, Oracle too? So
Oracle.
cute.
So
Uncle Larry missed out on a couple more billion.
he won't be able to buy his 6th yacht. I feel so bad.
Yeah.
So basically what happened is Oracle and IBM got knocked out of the running, I think, relatively early. Oracle did not take that lying down and filed all kinds of lawsuits, which were eventually struck down in court, as well as was their CIO or something mentioned it to Trump directly over a dinner or something. So, but that was all for naught. And then Google's employees staged at least one walkout and some other things to force Google out of the running for that. So they bowed out somewhat gracefully. And then it was pretty much down to Azure and AWS. AWS was the favored, or at least that was all the predictions were making, that they were going to win the contract. They are, after all, the larger of the two companies. But fortunately for Microsoft, they know how to play the government and enterprise game a little bit better than AWS does. And as a result, Microsoft was awarded the contract this past Friday. That was the 25th. So that is the official news. I am absolutely certain that AWS is going to challenge that in court, and this will drag out for at least another 2 years. But in the interim, yay for Microsoft. It's $1 billion, but it's not a happy billion. I
think the interesting thing here is that Microsoft didn't win it on its merits. It won it because Amazon lost, because Trump didn't like, and this is a straight up political play, Trump didn't like the fact that the Washington Post criticizes the current government, and he believes that Bezos, as the owner of Washington Post, must be out to get him. Honestly, I think Bezos couldn't care one way or the other, because he bought the Washington Post just as a bit of a fun social project to be nice to people, basically as, whatever. And I'm not sure that he cares one way or the other, but losing that contract has a lot of secondary impacts where there's a whole raft of other potential secret high classification projects that will happen around the world that Microsoft will now be positioned for, because they can say, we won the first one with the Pentagon in the USA. And the story, of course, was that the Pentagon chose AWS the first time, and second time, and the third time, until Oracle brought a court case, and they still chose AWS. And now President Trump's got involved and forced them to choose Azure. So it's not a win for Azure by any stretch of the imagination. It's not a vote of confidence in Azure. It's actually sort of what I call an Oracle effect, which is where you've played the game better. You didn't win on your merits. There's no question here that, to my mind, that Azure is the Betamax here, and that the winner here is AWS. But that doesn't make it any less hurtful, the fact that they lost. Does that make sense?
Yeah, I wish I could disagree with you, Greg, but I can't. My history with state government follows similar things. Nothing on this scale, smaller local state government here in my example, but I was involved with pretty large RFPs for telecommunication services. And how were they actually won? If you knew what was going on in the back room, all of the RFPs were written in such a way that they were fair to the letter of the law as required, but that only one vendor was going to win the one you wanted to win. That's
right.
how that was done. And the reason that was done, if you were, I was just a lowly engineer sitting around the conference table, but you could kind of hear as the higher ups would talk about these things. This was back a lot of years, if any of you know me and know some of my background. So don't get excited. But what was happening was people at the top who kind of wanted things to stay the same with the incumbent telecommunications provider would talk to the leaders of the incumbent telecommunications provider saying, how do we write this thing so that when you guys respond, it's very obvious that you're the ones we need to award this thing to? It was never phrased exactly as obviously as that and so on, because that might get some people upset, but that's what went on. In other words, there were politics involved. That's how business gets done. I would have people call me up at times because my name was listed as one of the people to respond to for some of these RFPs, and they'd go, hey, how do I get in on this? How can I present to you guys? And a few of them I would say, you can. I'm just saying, without saying, maybe it's not worth your time. Perhaps you do not wish to pursue this.
Yeah. You should really
things I can't
consider
say,
whether
things I can't say.
Yeah. You should really consider your position in this now that you're coming from behind.
Right.
You're very late in the process. Yes.
Yeah.
In other words, you're 2 years late because we were talking to vendors about potential solutions 2 years ago. Yeah.
I ran into a similar solution or situations where the company or the government agency had to put it to RFP because those were the rules. But they had already in their mind selected exactly who they wanted to work with.
Exactly.
So regardless of the responses, it was basically already locked in. It was a done deal, which always made responding to RFPs, if you didn't know that you were the pre-decided one, a little dicey, because you're like, is it worth the amount of time and effort I'm going to put in? I worked for, a couple of different VARs, and the decision was, is it worth spending a week writing up a 80-page response to this RFP, not knowing if the die was already cast, the person was already chosen, and you are just completely wasting your time and effort that could be spent chasing down new leads somewhere else. So that was always extremely frustrating. And it sounds like basically this was the same thing with Microsoft and AWS. Like AWS never entirely had a chance once Trump decided that he didn't want them to win the contract. And he's certainly not above, putting his thumb on the scale on anything.
Greg, I wanted to point out that I bet Jeff does care, because he's no longer the richest man in the world at last report. Bill Gates is. Now, I know Bill isn't as involved with Microsoft as he used to be, but still, Jeff might want that extra billion going into AWS, see if he can go past,
Yeah, like Amazon lost, what was it, $9 billion in a day of value, or some astonishingly large number.
Yeah,
when
which means you should buy stock at that moment because it's going to go
stock
back
drop
up.
7% or something.
In theory, yes, but there's no guarantees of that. That's the challenge that people are struggling with, is that AWS is spending a lot of money to build out its infrastructure. And the lesson from WeWork is that building out your infrastructure doesn't necessarily guarantee you a profit.
No, that's not the lesson from WeWork. The lesson from WeWork is that you should be brash, bold, and a complete moron, and you will get $1.42 billion to go away. I think you're right. What I learned. Where's my money? I can make terrible decisions too and lie about it. It's fine.
Oh, I just listened to a podcast where they dug into the history of it today, and this guy literally is a piece of work.
Oh,
but
I think my favorite, and I'll just leave it at this one. He created a separate company to trademark the We trademark and then licensed it back to WeWork for like $80 million or something for the trademark.
$5.9 million. Yeah.
Yeah, just
he leased it back for $5
more million.
Yeah. But the point here is that in theory, he should have a board. There's a board who controls what the CEO does, right? And the board is, in theory, meant to have validated this to make sure that it is not a conflict of interest. It is obviously a direct conflict of interest. But the point is that the CEO is also the major shareholder, and the board has to report to the shareholders. And of course, the other big shareholder was Mayoshi-san in the SoftBank funds. So in theory, between the CEO and the chief investor, the board actually had no say, because even if they went back to the investors and said, this is a direct conflict of interest, the two senior shareholders, SoftBank fund and the CEO himself, Adam Newman, would say, no, this is okay. So so all of the checks and balances just completely failed in this case. The checks and balances, the board should have done something, and they didn't, but hard not to blame them, because even if they had said something, they would have got shouted down anyway.
Right. They had no teeth.
Yeah. it's an interesting thing. I mean, even at the end of it, Adam Newman is so bad that he is worth minus $1 billion to WeWork, because that's what they had to do. They had to pay him $1 billion to go away. So
Just
his
go away,
actual
please.
value to the company is minus $1 billion.
It's amazing. I can only dream of accomplishing such a goal.
Yes. I personally aspire to be minus $1 billion worth. Yeah.
It's a good personal goal. Getting back to the JEDI thing, I'm just curious what everyone's thoughts are regarding any sort of negative press or employee walkouts or activism at the Microsoft level. I mean, some portions of Microsoft are absolutely like rank and file. Yes, I will do, whatever. They're not going to do a walkout, but Microsoft has, over the last, 4 or 5 years, gone on a hiring binge of open source type developers who have these very strong opinions. They're, developer advocates, developer relationship type people who, for instance, Seth Vargo doesn't work there, but he's an example of that type of personality who, if he feels there is an ethical conflict, he will do something like pull his entire GitHub repository offline that Chef was using heavily after the whole ICE thing. So do you think there will be any similar reactions from the Microsoft camp now that the contract's been awarded?
No,
Microsoft as a corporate culture, has from the get-go been about sharp elbows, do business hard, and victory over everyone. Like, it's not just enough to win; they have to
winning at any price. And if that means taking money from criminals, they'll do that.
Yeah,
and they'll,
and unlike Google, who came out in their IPO statement of "Don't be evil," who had this sort of "we love the world and we want to do good things." Microsoft never had that, aura about it from the beginning. So there may be pockets here and there of people who protest, and Microsoft will be like, "Okay, bye," and they will go along their merry way. Yeah, I don't anticipate the kind of backlash that Google got or Chef.
It's not the kinder, gentler Microsoft that we've all been led to
There's
understand.
no kinder, gentler Microsoft. There's just
the Linux hugging Microsoft and so on. Ned, is that what you're getting at?
Yeah, we love Linux.
No, that's
all about making
Linux.
the world a better place.
You might see it as embracing Linux. I see it as killing Linux. Keep your friends close, but keep your enemies closer.
Oh, I don't think so.
Microsoft's
I think they just don't care about Windows anymore.
No, they don't. They're happy to have Linux and let people develop it for them, and they run over the top. It's fine. They're not interested.
They care about it from a rent extraction point of view. I mean, it's already a substandard product that doesn't work, right? So, but idiots continue.
Which Windows or Linux?
Windows and Linux to a large extent. I mean, let's face it, Linux on the desktop is a pretty big challenge. I think you're right. Conceptually, Microsoft agrees that owning Microsoft Windows for the desktop or the laptop is not a growth industry going forward. Remember what I said about if you're not growing, you're dying. And that's the way capitalism works in the modern era. And the laptop desktop market is shrinking as smartphones go up. Microsoft's not in that market. Therefore, you flip that business unit into rent extraction. And that's where you take cash out, as much cash out as possible for the minimum amount of money that you put in. So you kill off all your R&D, you kill off all your product management, you kill off all the overheads and do the minimal amount of work. And this is where the Edge browser comes from. This is an attempt to reduce the cost of Microsoft Windows by throwing out all the trash in IE6, slimming down the operating system to a smaller, tighter bundle. And that means it costs less to make and it costs less to support, right? So this new Microsoft Windows, they're talking about it's got some fancy name, imaginary name around it. But it's like you can get old Windows with all of the old compatibility stuff, but it's unsafe to use. There's a new Windows, which has everything taken out. But that's also a Windows, which is cheap to make, cheap to support, and cheap to maintain, right? So there's two sides to that coin. So Microsoft is basically saying, well, Windows is done. We'll do what we can to slim down that money, extract the maximum amount of cash. We'll use that cash to fund the next phase of development. That's called rent extraction. And the same thing's happening there with Outlook Exchange on-prem, Microsoft SQL Server on-prem. All that stuff is now in rent extraction mode. You won't see them not doing anything with their hypervisor. I've forgotten the name for it because nobody talks about Hyper-V. That's it.
Hyper-V,
no one talks about it anymore because like that game was done 5 years ago. So basically, Microsoft has always had a reputation for working with government contracts. When the US government in particular rolls over and says, Microsoft, give us the data on your customers, they go, sure. Do you want all of it or just some of it? right? That's not a new thing. That's a 20-year thing. And if the British government rolls up and says to Microsoft, do you want it? They go, sure, here, have it. We're compliant with local laws, blah, blah, blah. That's, if you're working for Microsoft and you have any delusions whatsoever that Microsoft as an employer doesn't hate you and does not care about you, then you should really reevaluate your life choices, because you are nuts.
Should I? Yes. So I'm going to push back on a bunch of that, since I know some people that work at Microsoft, and
I know what people think they do. There's a big gap between what.
Yeah, let them speak.
So
I won't.
disagree that. And many of them are very happy with what they do, and they do have some ethical concerns, and they're able to voice them. Does it go all the way to the top? Maybe not, but you kind of have to stake your claim out in different business units, and obviously there are different fiefdoms within Microsoft that have very different ways of doing business, and it's been a point of huge friction when they want to get something done that is cross those business units. Some of the issues that have happened in Azure over the years have been a direct result of the fact that one particular business unit didn't want to work with the other one. I mean, I can't go any more detail about that, but it's definitely true. I would also push back on the fact that they have abandoned some of the products that you mentioned, because the services that they're now selling as a service use a lot of those products. So all of the innovation that's been put into Hyper-V, Exchange, SharePoint, SQL, those are all about making them run better in a cloud service where it can be metered and billed by the second. So they're definitely putting innovation into those things. Now, for an on-premises deployment, they're definitely less concerned about that. Exchange 2019 has some really interesting requirements around what type of customer you need to be to even license it. I don't remember the exact details, but it was something along the lines of you have to have like an enterprise agreement to even license it, and it has to run on a specific version of the Windows operating system. And it's basically because they're trying to get you to look exactly like how they deploy Exchange Online, because that's the only model they want to support.
Well, there's two sides to that. One is they want you to migrate to O365 for mail.
Oh, yeah.
But what they also want to do is reduce the cost of developing that product. And the way to do that is to deprecate all the legacy. Right?
Yes.
And to take out all the features that no one uses, throw those in the bin, simplify the pipeline, simplify the testing. And so when you do sell it, you make buku bucks, right? For the effort that you put in. So you're actually solving multiple agendas here. And so it's literally called rent extraction. You buy a product which has reached the end of its life, you sack all the developers, you put it in life support, you minimize the support costs, and just pull all the cash off it.
Right, and that's where I would push back, because they're not killing the product. It's not at the end of its lifespan. Exchange has a long lifespan. The on-prem version is, but they're going to be using at least some of the same developers to continue to develop the Exchange Online. And for that matter, I would say that most of their development shop for Exchange has already made the transition to working on Exchange Online. All the features that end up in the on-prem version have been running in Exchange Online for 3 to 5 years. So yeah, the priority of getting them down to the bits you run on the box, they don't care about that. And there's a lot of acrimony in the Exchange community about how that's happening. And it's kind of like the inevitable creep. There's nothing you can do about it.
It doesn't matter what you want. As a customer, you don't matter. Only what Microsoft wants matters. So stop fighting the inevitable and move on.
So Ned, I'm curious if, based on contacts you have at Microsoft, if you're hearing now the fact that Microsoft could potentially own this JEDI contract, will there be a pushback about we don't want to be involved with the Defense Department?
I have not heard anything in that regard. I mean, some of the teams I've talked to, they already worked with the government in various different aspects. So this is just more of the same. I mean, that's why I don't think there's going to be any pushback from Microsoft, because there was already Azure Gov Cloud. There are already plenty, there's a whole division of their sales force that works exclusively with government and state. So it's like, this is nothing new. It's just a continuation of what they already had. It's just that lately there have been so many people making these ethical objections about what companies do. I wondered if there would be, just a tag along effect to it at Microsoft, but I'm guessing no.
I mean, they've already had, months or even a year or more to voice this ethical concern about this contract. So if it hasn't happened by now, I can't imagine it popping up at this hour.
Yeah, right. And Microsoft doesn't care. They've been doing defense contracts for 30 years.
Mm-hmm.
They've been completely immoral about where they get their money from. That pattern is long entrenched. Complaining about it 30 years after it started is gone. That's the only difference between Google and Microsoft, is that people at Google, these are the first contracts that Google is doing, not the last. All right.
True.
And if you've been doing them for 30 years and giving the US government or the Chilean government Microsoft support, then that horse is bolted. You can try and make that work, but I mean, protests for protest's sake can create a change. I mean, look at Greta Thunberg, for example. She's been able to turn protesting for the sake of protesting about environment and actually made it stick. So there's definitely value in protesting if you're that way inclined, but I don't think the organization is going to be listening unless something happens in society more generally, until outside the company says, we expect companies to act morally and according to fair rules in society. And
there's
then,
a bigger issue in capitalism
happens,
here, though, and the bigger issue is money. That is, you can look at a lot of companies and go, if the dollar sign is big enough, they'll make decisions they might not have otherwise made. And so I'm curious, is Microsoft public enough about their Azure spend, how much money they're actually making from Azure? Gross or otherwise, so that we know how much $1 billion a year for 20 years, what's the impact to Azure's bottom line?
Yeah, I mean, they do release their financial results, and Azure is broken out as a separate line item.
Yep.
It's not like Google for a long time, and maybe still hides in Google Cloud along with a whole bunch of other stuff.
Yeah.
Probably because
Yeah,
it's insanely unprofitable. And what is it? 92% of their revenue comes from ads anyway. So why it's barely even a blip on their radar.
A lot of people will say that it's hard to imagine Google Cloud being serious when the company itself, the nature of the company, is to sell ads. And that's
their whole business.
Yeah.
I don't know why anybody thinks
Whereas
otherwise.
AWS depends on, where AWS is the profit generator for Amazon, and so it needs that business.
Yeah,
and Amazon needs AWS for itself. So there's
Amazon
a very
couldn't afford their one-day delivery that they've rolled out across the country, or they're rolling out. They could not afford to do that if AWS wasn't helping pay the bills. Because that is massively unprofitable for them to deliver something in one day. It makes no financial sense.
And there are fundamental differences in the way the business, if GCP wants to do something that might impact ads, it doesn't get to do that something. Then, whereas if AWS wants to do something that might impact retail, it gets a chance to fight that decision.
Right.
And one more point on the morality of tech companies. I'm glad that employees inside Google made these protests around JEDI, around Project Dragonfly, which was like a secret project to release a censor-friendly search engine in China. I'm glad they're actually forcing the company to live up to its espoused values. So if a company comes to market saying we want to be good, then you should be good. And so good on the employees for making Google live up to its values. Microsoft never had any, so it doesn't matter.
No, it did have
they
values.
had different values.
Exactly.
Yeah, yes, you're right. It's a different set of values.
Yeah. Might not be your values. They might not be reasonably moral values, but they do have values.
They had a set of beliefs. Yeah,
it's called whoring. Anything for cash.
Oh, I liked having my MVP. I'm going to be so sad to see it go after today.
I think you've done a great job of defending Microsoft and standing up for them. They definitely should keep you around.
Oh, thank you. I will quote just that and send it over.
Exactly.